Winston Churchill was one of the greatest public figures of the 20th century. For 5 years, he led Britain through some of her darkest hours. From the brink of defeat to final victory in a great world conflict.
I've never known anyone more assiduous in pursuing what he believed to be the best interest of his country.
But in the early 1930s, Churchill made a mistake that was to destroy his reputation and which explains what is to many people one of the great mysteries of 20th century British history.
It certainly hung round his neck the reputation of being a man of bad judgment, moved by passions rather than by reason and information.
I think people thought he was a complete buffoon and that he had poor judgment. He was somebody who, you know, was very entertaining at the dispatch box, but usually very, very unreliable. He was usually very easy to defeat.
We're all under the pressure of events.
I don't think anybody could, in the course of his career, have done so much with all his genius and skills to harm and savage his reputation.
On the 3rd of September 1939, the day Britain declared war on Germany, Winston Churchill was welcomed back into the government as First Lord of the Admiralty. But less than a year earlier, the man who was to become the saviour of his country in her darkest hour had been booed in Parliament and beyond. Throughout the 1930s, Churchill was a politician in the political wilderness. War came as no surprise to him. He had been warning about the German threat for years. But nobody had taken much notice of a public figure with a tainted reputation.
It was tragic, and Churchill felt it himself, that he didn't have the number of sympathisers and followers in his own party that he deserved. But many of the younger men who would normally have been attracted to this strong lead to make a stand against Germany, you know, again and again were made to feel that the old chap wasn't entirely trustworthy.
Why was a great politician who was constantly warning his country about the very real threat of Nazi Germany left out of 3 successive governments in the 1930s? Why could we not trust the one person who got it right about Hitler? Because in the early 1930s, Winston Churchill pitched himself against the political establishment of the day, a mistake that tore apart his reputation and threw him into the wilderness for 10 critical years. At stake was whether British-ruled India should be given a degree of independence, and Churchill's extreme opposition to the idea proved to be a near-fatal error of judgment.
He felt that the empire was absolutely the only thing really worth fighting for, you know, that the empire was the embodiment of British civilization, and British civilization was the embodiment of world civilization. And so if you weren't going to defend that, you know, there was no point defending anything.
He regarded the empire as good, perhaps as almost totally good and permanent, and British rule in India as really central to Britain's power and place in the world, and Britain's superiority, if you like, racial superiority.
It certainly rested on a belief that the white peoples of Europe were better able to run a government than coloured people. Churchill was not a racist in the awful Hitler Nazi sense, but he did believe that the white people had a certain superiority, at any rate in terms of civilization. They were more advanced.
Churchill hated the idea of losing India and wasn't about to give up the jewel in the British Empire crown without a fight. But his battle to keep India British was to be his greatest political mistake.
He went on and on from about 1929 to about 1935, beating the Indian drum very, very, very hard. And I think people got bored with it, they got fed up with it, they said, no, Churchill's out on a limb here. And the problem for the country was that it branded him as a Cassandra, you know, that his prophecies were unsound.
The mistrust that grew up around Churchill because of his India campaign had grave implications for the other great cause in his life, to warn and protect his country against the threat from Germany.
People felt that he was a complete loose cannon. I mean, it was a suspicion that people had had about him before, that he was unpredictable, that he was untrustworthy, that he had poor judgment, that he cared more about his own career than he did about the party. And I think that can only have damaged his reputation in a way that was very significant when he actually got hold of a cause that was justified later on, which was the rearmament cause.
Winston Churchill famously spent the 1930s in the political wilderness. But the extremism and unreliability that characterized his India campaign had been in evidence for years. The aristocrat-turned-politician had already achieved infamy as an outspoken and controversial careerist. Born on the 30th of November 1874 at Blenheim Palace in Oxfordshire, Winston Spencer Churchill was the eldest son of the prominent Tory politician Lord Randolph Churchill. Aged 20, Winston joined the army. He fought with the 4th Hussars against the Indians on the turbulent northwest frontier. During one period of intense action, he wrote,
"I rode on my grey pony all along the skirmish line, when everyone else was lying down in cover. Foolish perhaps, but I play for high stakes, and given an audience, there is no act too daring or too noble."
The young Winston was mentioned in dispatches for his courage and resolution. This period of fighting in India ingrained in Churchill the imperialist ideas that lay at the root of his great political blunder in later life. In 1899, he became a war correspondent. He reported the Boer War in South Africa and became a household name when he was captured. His account of a miraculous escape made him a national hero. But throughout this period, Churchill's heart lay elsewhere. Politics was his passion, and he wanted to follow in his father's footsteps as soon as possible.
Other young soldiers were going to sleep in the afternoons, or reading Ruff's Guide to the Turf. That was about as intellectual as they got. Churchill, on the other hand, was preparing himself for a political career.
Things finally took off for Churchill in the 1900 general election, when he won the Conservative seat for Oldham. But he was soon causing trouble. A keen advocate of social reform, he was fed up with the staid policies of the Tory grandees. And in 1904, he caused uproar by crossing the floor of the House of Commons to join the Liberals.
He had such confidence in his own judgment and such a willful determination to make his own mark irrespective of party connections that he seems to have thought that he could do it in whatever connection he was actually placed. He didn't think carefully about the political costs of what he was doing.
From the beginning, Churchill demonstrated the failings of character, disloyalty, impulsiveness, impatience, that tainted his reputation so severely in the 1930s.
Not only did he cross to the Liberal benches, which was very unusual to change party, but he turned on his former colleagues, friends, the people of his class, with tremendous savagery, wit, energy, zeal. He knew their weaknesses and foibles, he exposed them, and they couldn't stand that.
Churchill did well with the Liberals, who came to power only a year later. But when the Tories finally returned to office after the First World War, his political career was brought to an abrupt halt. Nobody could forgive his betrayal of the party.
People were beginning already to wonder whether Churchill was a sound fellow, whether he was going to be consistent. And really quite early on, after he crossed the floor and joined the Liberals, there were Tories saying, he'll be back. You know, he's going to re-rat. Having ratted, he'll re-rat.
With the Conservatives back in power and the Liberal era over, Winston Churchill was now a political outcast, a politician without a party or a seat. In September 1922, he bought Chartwell, a manor house tucked away in the Kent countryside. His wife Clementine, who Churchill had married over a decade earlier, fell in love with the place immediately.
I feel that we shall live there a great deal and be very happy.
Churchill had no problem occupying his time at home. But what he really wanted was to be back in politics. He decided to return to his old party. But it was 20 years since he'd been with the Conservatives, and his wife Clementine was not convinced about the idea.
Do not let the Tories get you too cheap. They have treated you so badly in the past, and they ought to be made to feel it.
It was not until the 1924 general election that Churchill found a way back. He became Conservative MP for Epping, and after 2 years out of politics, he was bowled over when Prime Minister Stanley Baldwin offered him the job of Chancellor of the Exchequer.
I think the old adage probably runs true as far as Baldwin was concerned, that he'd rather have him inside the tent rather than outside the tent, because Churchill outside the tent could make a thorough nuisance of himself, whereas Churchill inside the tent could bring his marvellous force of rhetoric to bear on defeating the opposition rather than stabbing the Tories in the back.
Churchill spent 5 years as Chancellor, but the 1929 general election saw in a new Labour government and another sudden halt to his political career. Age 54, Winston Churchill was not to see high office again for 10 years. Fresh from election defeat, he now embarked upon 2 political campaigns. One would destroy his reputation, the other would eventually propel him to the premiership. The following decade was to be the stormiest of Churchill's life. With time on his hands, he left for a tour of America, unaware of plans being hatched by the new Labour government regarding a subject close to his heart. The issue was India. For nearly a century, this vast subcontinent had been part of the British Empire. 100,000 British soldiers and administrators ruled over 250 million Indians. But the tide was turning. Fired by the emergence of Mahatma Gandhi, nationalism was on the rise. Indians were fed up with colonial British rule, and by the 1920s, the stakes were raised when Gandhi decided that the time was right for civil disobedience.
People like Gandhi and Nehru wanted India to achieve independence as a unified state, and so they wanted more power from the British to be given to them at the centre. They didn't want any more shilly-shallying around in the regions. They wanted more central autonomy, and that was where the idea of dominion status came from.
Aware of the escalating problem in India, the British government had come up with the idea of self-government in the provinces. But for the Indians, this was not enough. They wanted dominion status, giving them the right of central self-government, just like the other dominions, such as Canada and Australia. Gandhi's best friend in Britain was the new British Viceroy of India, Lord Irwin, later to become Foreign Secretary, Lord Halifax. Irwin, a staunch conservative, saw firsthand what was happening in India. He knew that negotiations with the Indian leaders were inevitable, and he had little trouble convincing politicians from all parties with his progressive ideas.
Most Conservatives and all Labour people and all Liberals had come to believe that India must move forward towards dominion status. The older Victorian idea was out of date. You couldn't any longer sit with armed power on top of a people which was producing an educated middle class and the capacity to govern itself and the demand to govern itself.
By the end of 1929, the news reached Churchill that plans to move India towards dominion status were well underway.
Churchill was absolutely furious. He felt that it was a betrayal of everything that Britain ought to stand for. It was a betrayal of the empire. It was a betrayal of our duty towards the Indians themselves. What would happen is that if India got self-rule, it would fall to pieces as an entity. But I think basically it was a feeling that the British imperial position would be fatally eroded by this move.
Only days after his return from America, Churchill wrote an article in the Daily Mail that marked the beginning of a 5-year campaign against his government's India policy.
The idea that Home Rule for India, or Dominion status, or full responsible government for India can emerge from anything that is now being done, or inquired into, is not only fantastic in itself, but criminally mischievous in its effects.
I think the problem was that he's a 19th century politician in a 20th century world. The difference, I think, between Churchill and these more moderate politicians was that they could see the writing on the wall. They could see that India was changing, Indian politics was changing, and you couldn't carry on governing it as you had in the 1860s and 1870s. And fundamentally, Churchill couldn't see that, or if he could see it, he wouldn't accept it.
Churchill's views about India were formed over 3 decades earlier during his imperial adventures on the northwest frontier.
He'd been in India in the Victorian times, and he'd seen India in its most imperial phase, and he had been a soldier, and he'd fought in the wars which, as it were, established the frontiers of India. And his view of India was very much that Britain was there to stay, that Britain was the one unifying factor, the one factor that would preserve peace.
Churchill was not about to stand by and watch Britain lose its hold on India. He pulled out all the stops and was even recorded by British movie-tone news pleading his case for empire.
Things are going from bad to worse. Great mismanagement and weakness are causing unrest and disturbance to 300 million primitive people whose well-being is in our care.
Central to his imperialism and his blimpishness, or whatever one calls it, was his belief that once you had any evolution towards Indian independence, then it would break up, or there'd be a civil war, there'd be bloodletting, the Muslims would go their way, there'd be an independent Muslim state, Hindu, as happened. And that was really his nightmare.
For I feel that the Indian danger will raise a crisis equal in importance to the greatest events in the history of Great Britain.
Churchill's doubts, anxieties about giving India independence reflected the innate conservatism of a great number of people in this country. Even if they voted Labour, they had a kind of conservative impulse to preserve what we had, that is to say, to maintain the empire, partly as a good thing, partly as something which stood us in good stead and in good standing with the rest of the world.
Churchill was to spend the next 4 years on and off the India campaign trail. He travelled the country making speeches and rallying old-school imperialists to his cause. Despite Churchill's efforts and enthusiasm, negotiations to give India a degree of liberty were steadily progressing. By the beginning of 1931, a series of round-table conferences with British and Indian representatives were well underway, chaired by the new Labour Prime Minister, Ramsay MacDonald.
Goodbye. Thank you so much for the help you've given us and the nice things you said about it. Goodbye.
Less than a year later, Anglo-Indian negotiations were given a further boost when Mahatma Gandhi agreed to attend another conference in London in September 1931. The national cause of Gandhi was completely incomprehensible to Churchill, who made little effort to hide his contempt for the Indian hero.
It is alarming and also nauseating to see Mr. Gandhi, a seditious Middle Temple lawyer, now posing as a fakir of a type well known in the East.
He thought that really Indians, they might be clever, particularly Indians like Gandhi. They might be very clever, very cunning, but they weren't people, they weren't trustworthy. You know, they didn't play by, you know, the rules, if you like. And so there was something deeply humiliating about white politicians like Irwin being seen to parley on equal terms with Gandhi. And he was very, very angry about that.
Churchill was backing the extreme end of an unpopular cause, and the impact was devastating. Whilst his undoubted talents were recognised, he was seen as a maverick politician, not to be trusted. Everyone seemed to have something to say about Winston Churchill.
He is so far and away the most talented man in political life. But that does not prevent me from feeling politically that he is a great danger. Largely because of his love of crises and...
Loathed by the Tories whom he left and has now returned to, distrusted by the Liberals, on whose backs he first mounted to power,
political judgment.
hated by
On the
Labour,
contrary, the brilliance of his speeches only makes the errors in his judgment the more conspicuous.
I believe in Winston's capability, if only he were a bit more steady. But you never know what kite he is going to fly next.
Democratic government does require a certain amount of government by consent, don't forget. It requires a certain amount of cooperation. And Churchill was not seen, even by his best friends in the 1930s, as a tremendous cooperator.
By the early 1930s, Churchill's campaign was making him enemies. Serious rifts were developing within the party. The member for Epping was now firmly pitched against his own leader, Stanley Baldwin. The two men were poles apart over the India issue, and there were even suspicions that Churchill's campaign was just a cover for an attempt to topple his former Prime Minister.
Many Conservatives felt, and it must have been an element in Churchill's thinking, that the India crusade was not, when all said and done, about India. It was about somehow replacing Baldwin as leader of the Conservative Party. I mean, there are fascinating things in Conservative Central Office archives about how the party managers worry that Churchill is somehow making Baldwin look ridiculous in different ways.
Baldwin once said of Churchill, "When Winston was born, lots of fairies swooped down on his cradle with gifts, imagination, eloquence, industry, ability. And then came a fairy who said, 'No one person has a right to so many gifts,' picked him up and gave him such a shake and twist that with all these gifts he was denied judgment and wisdom. And that is why, while we delight to listen to him in this house, we do not take his advice."
When he was worked up about something, he could stray into the realm of assertion and rhetoric beyond his knowledge. About India, he was convicted again and again of ignorance. When he gave evidence to a House of Commons committee at the time of the India Bill, he was tripped up by those who knew about India, and again because he didn't.
I think people thought he was a complete buffoon, that he didn't know much about it, which he didn't, and that he had poor judgment. He'd shown poor judgment before. He was somebody who, you know, was very entertaining at the dispatch box. He was someone who made hugely entertaining, colourful speeches, but usually very, very unreliable. He was usually very easy to defeat.
And defeated he was. After his 5-year battle, eventually in June 1935, the India Bill had its third reading in the House of Commons. This moment marked a cautious step forward towards self-government for India and the end of Churchill's explosive empire campaign. By now, the ex-Conservative Chancellor was seen as one of the most controversial figures in British political life.
There's no doubt that his 4 or 5 year crusade against the India Bill damaged him in the minds of the very people the Conservative Party leadership and the Conservative Party rank and file, on whom he was to depend not only for support in anti-appeasement, but also to come into government. That was his ideal, to be at the centre. And they regarded him as unreliable, dangerous, frivolous, harmful to the party, which is a crime, and wrong.
That same summer, Churchill suffered a further blow when Stanley Baldwin took over as Conservative Prime Minister. Baldwin did not include his former Chancellor on the front bench, and the cabinet door was, once again, closed on Winston Churchill.
To believe that you could keep the British Empire going forever, that you could avoid giving India independence, was a tremendous mistake. On the other hand, it is possible to admire an opponent who disagrees with you, but disagrees with you passionately and is prepared to sacrifice their career for a principle that they believe in.
Churchill's mistakes and misjudgments over the India issue proved a major handicap in his other great campaign of the 1930s. For years he had been obsessed with the issue of defence, the defence of his country. Churchill's long and prolific association with this matter began in 1911, when he was made First Lord of the Admiralty, 3 years before the outbreak of the First World War.
Now, he was a believer in deterrence. He always believed that if you have a strong navy, a strong army, and ultimately a strong air force, you will deter Germany. But it didn't happen in the First World War, and he felt, looking back, that it hadn't happened because Britain hadn't been firm enough in stating to the Germans, look, we will not tolerate your attacking France or whatever. We will not tolerate your aggression in Europe.
Just over a decade after the First World War, Churchill was once again primed against events in Germany. The Nazi movement was in full swing, screaming for a new order based on racial purity. Churchill watched these events unfold with terror in his heart.
He had an intuition about Hitler. He quite early decided that Hitler was diabolic and that the Nazi creed was sinister. But he also saw that Hitler, more early than any other important British public figure, that Hitler was not a man to be trusted or to be rationally dealt with.
For many people, he made himself so ridiculous, so extreme with his Indian warnings, that there was a grave danger that his warnings against Nazism would simply be dismissed as yet another raving of a lunatic.
His rhetoric was too overblown, it was too overcharged. He'd used up all his best phrases, as it were, attacking Gandhi. And then for him to turn around and attack Hitler in the same sort of vein meant that he'd undermined his own position.
Even before Hitler became Chancellor in 1933, Churchill was warning about the dangers of German rearmament. It was 6 years before the outbreak of the Second World War, and Winston Churchill's campaign to prepare and protect his country had begun.
He said, look, it's all a question of time. We can sit back and in 5 years' time, in 1938, 1939, 1940, we can suddenly find that Germany is massively rearmed and we're in a hopeless situation. We'll have to give in. We'll have to accept whatever happens. We won't be strong enough to resist German aggression.
But Britain had suffered serious economic depression in the early 1930s, and the last thing the government wanted to hear about was Churchill's demands for more spending on defence. However, this did not deter him, and he continued to mount attack after attack on his leaders.
I have marshalled the facts, but I have not overdrawn the picture. Alone among the nations we have disarmed, while others have rearmed. I am sorry to be so pessimistic. Britain is weaker. And Britain's hour of weakness is Europe's hour of danger. The war mentality is springing up again. Nobody can watch the events which are taking place in Germany without increasing anxiety about what their outcome will be. There is a grave reason to believe that Germany is arming herself.
Churchill's campaign to protect his country was winning him few friends. The British public didn't realise or want to acknowledge the horror that was unfolding under the Nazis. The memories of the last Great War were too fresh. Nobody wanted to hear about new threats from Germany.
Pretty well every family in the country had members killed or wounded in the First World War. There were mementos of the First World War on every wall and mantelpiece in Britain. The slaughter had been enormous, and remember that even by 1939 it was nearer to the people in Britain than the Falklands War is to us now. It was a very recent event.
Everybody knew somebody who'd been killed. Village war memorials were stiff with names. Everybody had lost someone. And the idea that you might be entering a far worse conflict, this time with bombs raining down on the civilian population as well as men in the front line, just could hardly be borne. You could hardly bear to think about it, that such a thing should happen.
I'm world weary, world weary.
Things were not looking good for Churchill. He was a politician with a tainted reputation, and, perhaps even more significantly by this point, one that was telling the British people what they didn't want to hear.
I want an ocean blue, great big trees, a bird's eye.
This could well have been the end of his career. And I found a letter which he wrote where he says, effectively, you know, I've had my political career. I've done what I can do. There's no, Baldwin is not going to bring me in, so there's no point in my thinking I'm going to be in government again.
But Churchill didn't give up. Driven by his obsession with Germany, he retreated to Chartwell, which soon became the nerve centre for Britain's movement against complacency and disarmament. Those who understood the reality of the Nazi threat knew where to go, and with them came much-needed information.
Right from the start, he appreciated the value of secret information, and he went on getting secret information from all sorts of sources throughout the 1930s. He was incredibly well informed about what was happening in Germany. So he was like the sort of spider in the middle of the web at Chartwell, getting all this information and using it as a sort of raw material for his great speeches in the Commons.
One of Churchill's sources was a civil servant called Desmond Morton, who lived just 10 minutes away from Chartwell. Throughout the 1930s, Morton supplied Churchill with secret information about German industrial and aircraft production, and all with the full consent of the government.
When Churchill went onto the backbenches, he asked Morton if Morton would go to the then Prime Minister, Ramsay MacDonald, and ask if, exceptionally, he, Churchill, could continue to have access to secret intelligence. And amazingly, and I don't think it had ever happened before in British history, the Prime Minister, Ramsay MacDonald, said, give him all that he wants. Keep him informed.
People still did think of him as important. And it's noticeable that no fewer than 3 prime ministers all said that he must be given secret information about what the Nazis were up to. Even though he was in opposition, and even though he used that information as a stick to beat them with. Why did this happen? It happened because people recognized that in spite of everything, Churchill was a great man.
By 1936, Churchill was ready to deliver his most famous attack yet on the government and his own party. On the 12th of November, almost 3 years before the outbreak of war, this speech was an extraordinary catalogue of ignored warnings and lost opportunities.
Owing to past neglect, in the face of the plainest warnings, we have now entered a period of danger greater than has befallen Britain. I never would have believed that we should have been allowed to go on getting into this plight, month by month and year by year. The era of procrastination, of half measures, of soothing and baffling expedients, of delays, is coming to its close. In its place, we are entering a period of consequences.
For a government desperate to keep defence spending down, Churchill's attacks, fed by the information he was receiving, were not helpful. Nobody had anticipated the significance of the secrets about Germany being delivered to Chartwell.
I don't think it was foreseen that the kind of intelligence that would be given to Churchill would enable him to emerge as a thorn in the government's side. So nobody, I think, could have foreseen in 1929 or the early 1930s the consequences of allowing Churchill unprecedented access as a backbencher to top-secret intelligence.
But just as Churchill's campaign seemed to be gaining momentum and credibility, he made another gross error of judgment, yet again pitching himself against the political establishment of the day. Britain was on the edge of a constitutional crisis. The new king, Edward VIII, was having an affair with an American divorcee, Wallis Simpson, and there was growing concern in Parliament about the royal liaison.
Mad about the boy, it's pretty funny, but I'm mad about the boy. He has a game.
In 1930s Britain, a degree of indiscretion was acceptable in royal circles, but for the new king, this was not enough. He wanted to marry his lover and went to Prime Minister Baldwin seeking permission to do so. The idea of marriage between the head of the Church of England and an American divorcee sent the government into panic. King Edward VIII turned to his old friend Churchill for advice and guidance in the matter. And as the crisis unfolded, Winston Churchill found himself on the front line of a major political and national upheaval.
Churchill was a great romantic. He had a loving and happy marriage himself. He believed in a loving and happy marriage, and he felt intensely loyal to the man he saw as his monarch. And I think that perhaps explains his total dedication at that time to the king.
Churchill's support of the king had a devastating impact on his reputation. Harold Nicholson, a well-known commentator of the day, wrote, "He has undone in 5 minutes the patient reconstruction works of 2 years."
The mood of the country was very much pro-Baldwin, anti-Edward VIII. Edward VIII was seen as a sort of playboy who had let the side down by wanting to marry this American. Churchill was supporting him. It absolutely cut the ground from underneath his feet and made him even more of a voice crying in the wilderness during the mid to late 1930s.
I travel alone. Sometimes I'm east, sometimes I'm west. No chains can ever bind me. And no
Churchill remained characteristically defiant. On the 1st of January 1937, just days after King Edward VIII abdicated, he wrote in a letter,
I do not feel that my own political position is much affected by the line I took. But even if it were, I should not wish to have acted otherwise.
Churchill's part in the abdication crisis was another big mistake at a critical time. Just weeks later, he was denied office yet again when Neville Chamberlain took over as Conservative Prime Minister. Lord Halifax, Churchill's old foe over India, became Foreign Secretary. And then came appeasement, an attempt to meet Hitler's demands for more territory in the hope of maintaining peace.
Appeasement was based on the belief that some of Hitler's demands were at any rate reasonable. So you meet the reasonable demands, Adolf Hitler is going to be satisfied, peace will break out for the foreseeable future. The thing that was wrong with it, of course, is that Adolf Hitler was a profoundly unreasonable person. There was no way that he could be satisfied.
As Chamberlain and Halifax tried to appease Hitler, so began Britain's descent towards war. On the 29th of September 1938, the Conservative Prime Minister signed an agreement with the German Chancellor. The purpose of the Munich Agreement was to meet Hitler's demands for the German occupation of certain territory in Czechoslovakia, in the hope that this would guarantee peace.
This morning, I had another talk with the German Chancellor, Herr Hitler. And here is the paper which bears his name upon it as well as mine.
Chamberlain was declared the Prince of Peace when he returned from Germany. But with prophetic accuracy, Winston Churchill knew the enormity of the political blunder that had just taken place.
I think you will find that in a period of time which may be measured by years, but which may be measured only by months, Czechoslovakia will be engulfed in the Nazi regime.
But it was Chamberlain, the Prince of Peace, not Churchill, who was telling the British people what they wanted to hear. Even now, less than a year away from war, Winston Churchill was still viewed by many as the hysterical maverick of the India campaign.
Churchill is deeply unpopular in the country when Chamberlain comes back. Chamberlain stands on the balcony of Buckingham Palace, surrounded by the royal family with the king. He gets total endorsement. He's a national figure. Churchill, by contrast, is seen as a sort of a positive danger, somebody who actually might like war.
The country may have been too frightened and naive to acknowledge Winston Churchill's words, but when Hitler made his move on Czechoslovakia in March 1939, the realization dawned. Hadn't Churchill warned the government about this in a speech only 5 months earlier?
I remember asking one of Chamberlain's ministers how he had felt during one of Churchill's great speeches, the one after Munich, when he made this sustained criticism of the government's policy, which this minister, like the other ministers, had, of course, you know, they regarded Churchill as quite wrong. And he said, I suddenly discovered while I was listening to him that my palms were sweating. Because they somehow sensed this is not a game, this is not a crusade, as, if you like, the India had become. This is reality, this is our own future, this is our fate.
It was not until the 3rd of September 1939, the day Britain declared war on Germany, that Churchill was finally brought back into the government. It was a decade since he had held office as Baldwin's Chancellor, 10 years spent in the political wilderness.
For a man who had been in the 1930s so much at odds with his own party, so much out on a limb by himself, suddenly to come back in 1939 as First Lord of the Admiralty was remarkable. It's as if this body of respect for Churchill's military expertise and war capability swept back to push aside the 1930s oddities in his career and set them aside in an extraordinary way.
You realize politics is an unpredictable business. It's nobody can ever plot the future in politics. And so it's a perfectly natural historical thing for a man held to have made countless mistakes and misjudgments, particularly by his opponents, should suddenly become the saviour of his country.
The force of personality that threw Winston Churchill into the wilderness was the very thing that propelled him so swiftly and decisively to ultimate power. And when the call finally came, the very people who had condemned him gave thanks for his return.
One of the reasons why the British people had such enormous faith in him is they could depend on him to believe what he was saying. He'd paid the price of saying what he believed in for the 10 previous years, and that price was a very heavy one. It was being in the political wilderness. So back in power, they knew they could trust him.
You can see the first part of Martin Gilbert's acclaimed biography of Winston Churchill tomorrow on UK TV History at 10 o'clock. Next, Churchill's first D-Day, the story of Gallipoli, and over on Documentary Next have I got 1992 for you.
Politician who was constantly warning his country about the very real threat of Nazi Germany, left out of 3 successive governments in the 1930s. Why could we not trust the one person who got it right about Hitler? Because in the early 1930s, Winston Churchill pitched himself against the political establishment of the day, a mistake that tore apart his reputation and threw him into the wilderness for 10 critical years. At stake was whether British-ruled India should be given a degree of independence, and Churchill's extreme opposition to the idea proved to be a near-fatal error of judgment.
He felt that the empire was absolutely the only thing really worth fighting for, you know, that the empire was the embodiment of British civilization.
Winston Churchill was one of the greatest public figures of the 20th century. For 5 years, he led Britain through some of her darkest hours, from the brink of defeat to final victory in a great world conflict.
I've never known anyone more assiduous in pursuing what he believed to be the best interest of his country.
But in the early 1930s, Churchill made a mistake that was to destroy his reputation, and which explains what is to many people one of the great mysteries of 20th century British history.
It certainly hung round his neck the reputation of being a man of bad judgment, moved by passions rather than by reason.
And British civilization was the embodiment of world civilization. And so if you weren't going to defend that, you know, there was no point defending anything.
He regarded the empire as good, perhaps as almost totally good and permanent. And British rule in India is really central to Britain's power and place in the world, and Britain's superiority, if you like, racial superiority.
It certainly rested on a belief that the white peoples of Europe were better able to run a government than coloured people. Churchill was not a racist in the awful Hitler Nazi sense, but he did believe that the white people had a certain superiority, at any rate in terms of civilization. They were more advanced.
Churchill, the man who was to become the saviour of his country in her darkest hour, had been booed in Parliament and beyond. Throughout the 1930s, Churchill was a politician in the political wilderness. War came as no surprise to him. He had been warning about the German threat for years. But nobody had taken much notice of a public figure with a tainted reputation.
It was tragic, and Churchill felt it himself, that he didn't have the number of sympathisers and followers in his own party that he deserved. But many of the younger men who would normally have been attracted to this strong lead to make a stand against Germany, you know, again and again were made to feel that the old chap wasn't entirely trustworthy.
Why was a great
and information?
I think people thought he was a complete buffoon and that he had poor judgment. He was somebody who, you know, was very entertaining at the dispatch box, but usually very, very unreliable. He was usually very easy to defeat.
We're all under the pressure of events.
I don't think anybody could, in the course of his career, have done so much with all his genius and skills, to harm and savage his reputation.
On the 3rd of September 1939, the day Britain declared war on Germany, Winston Churchill was welcomed back into the government as First Lord of the Admiralty. But less than a year earlier,